Hi everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of Horror Stories. Tonight, we're venturing deep into the darkness with 3 chilling true park ranger horror stories. Tales that blur the line between reality and nightmare. These are not just stories, they're real experiences shared by those who have seen what lurks in the forgotten corners of our national parks, where the silence is heavy and the trees remember everything. So, find a quiet place, turn off the lights, and prepare yourself. Because once these stories begin, you might start to wonder, what's really waiting out there beyond the trail? If you'd like to support the channel, the best way is to like, share, and subscribe. Your support keeps these dark tales alive. And don't forget to comment below and tell me where you're listening from. Alright, if you're ready, let's step into tonight's terrifying stories. I began working as a park ranger at Deep Hollow National Forest in northern Montana in the fall of 2016, just before the first snow touched the upper ridges. The forest stretched for over 200,000 acres, its terrain rough and layered with canyons that swallowed light even at midday. I had transferred there after 5 quiet years at a smaller park in Oregon, hoping the isolation might clear my head from everything I had been carrying. I had recently lost my younger brother in an accident that had shaken every sense of meaning I'd had. I wanted silence, cold, and distance, thinking the wilderness might numb what grief could not. Deep Hollow was unlike anywhere else I had ever worked. It was a place that refused to feel tamed, even by the steady hum of ranger trucks and the crunch of boots along its patrol trails. The forest grew dense so quickly that a man could walk half a mile from the ranger station and already feel as though the world had forgotten him. There were reports of vanished hikers, a few going back decades, but that was not uncommon in places as large and remote as this. People underestimated the scale of the wild. It swallowed mistakes the way the ocean swallowed small boats. My days began early, around 5 in the morning, when frost clung to the ranger station's windows and the air smelled of frozen pine. I would drink burnt coffee, check the patrol logs, and head out into the gray woods in my old Ford. The roads were long ribbons of dirt threading between enormous trunks, and when the sun rose it came weak and slow through the fog. It took time for Deep Hollow to reveal itself. It was a forest that made you earn its view. I had been assigned to a remote sector known as Region 12, a section few visitors ever reached. It bordered a network of deep limestone caverns that had never been fully mapped. The area was restricted to tourists because of unstable ground and old mine shafts dating back to the late 1800s. But despite the posted warnings, some still hiked there to explore or camp illegally. My job was to find them before the terrain did. On my first patrol through that sector, I noticed how the ground sank slightly beneath the trees in long dips, as if something hollow lay beneath the roots. Birds rarely sang there. It was always still, always colder. Even the light seemed to bend strangely, becoming pale and almost metallic as it passed through the canopy. I marked the boundaries on my GPS and reported nothing unusual, but deep down, something about that quiet stayed with me. Weeks passed uneventfully until late November, when the first snow fell heavy enough to close several trails. I was scheduled for the night shift, covering radio duties, and a final sweep before the storm worsened. It was close to midnight when I picked up a weak signal on the emergency channel. Faint static, then a burst of noise that could have been a transmission. I turned the volume higher, thinking it was interference, but the signal repeated every few minutes from a specific direction, south, deep into Region 12. It wasn't uncommon for broken transmitters from old research teams to come alive again briefly when the cold hit, but something about this frequency was different. It pulsed like a heartbeat, rhythmic and deliberate. I should have logged it and left it for the next morning's tech inspection, but my instincts wouldn't allow it. I geared up, strapped a flashlight to my jacket, and took the truck into the snow. The forest that night was all silver and silence. My headlights scattered through the flakes, illuminating trees that seemed to lean closer as I passed. The wind had dropped to nothing. Only the hum of the engine filled the dark. After about an hour, I reached the dirt access road that led toward the restricted caverns. My GPS flickered uncertainly, the screen dimming and brightening as if the signal itself was being swallowed. I parked near a marker post and continued on foot. Snow reached my knees by then. I followed the direction of the transmission, checking my compass every few minutes. The deeper I went, the heavier the air felt. It wasn't just cold. It carried a thickness that pressed against my chest, slowing my breath. The trees thinned, giving way to a wide hollow filled with drifts of snow and low mist that hovered close to the ground. The signal was stronger now, crackling at steady intervals. And then I saw the lights. They shimmered beneath the surface of the snow, faint and colorless, moving like slow underwater currents. I stood frozen, the radio pressed to my chest, watching them twist and pulse as though alive. The glow wasn't natural. It wasn't from a buried flashlight or any reflective surface. It was too steady, too deep. I knelt and brushed away the top layer of snow, revealing something solid and smooth beneath, a circular patch of ice that stretched wider than I could see in the dim beam of my light. The glow came from beneath it. For a long moment, I just stared, trying to understand what I was seeing. The light wasn't static. It seemed to breathe. A rhythm pulsed through it, faintly visible under the frozen surface. Then, in one sharp flicker, my flashlight cut out. The beam died. The radio went silent, and I was left alone in the snow with that faint, ghostly shimmer glowing upward. The silence that followed was suffocating. Even my own heartbeat felt muted. I could no longer hear the wind, or the creak of trees, or the faint rustle of snow shifting under its weight. There was only the stillness and that cold, growing light below my boots. When the radio came back alive seconds later, it wasn't static I heard. It was a sound too deep and low to belong to any device. It vibrated through the ground, a hum that felt ancient, almost like a voice buried beneath the ice. And as I turned to leave, I saw what looked like footprints leading toward the glowing hollow, fresh, deep, and ending at the edge of the frozen circle. But there were none leading away. I stood there for a long time, staring at the prints disappearing into the pale shimmer of the hollow. They were human, barefoot, judging by the shape and length, but too large to make sense, too clean in the soft, shifting snow. Even as the wind began to stir again, those impressions didn't soften or fill. They stayed sharply cut, as though the ground refused to erase them. I tried to tell myself it was an illusion, maybe melt pockets forming beneath the ice. I'd been out too long in freezing air, my perception dimmed by exhaustion. Yet something in me knew that wasn't true. There was a stillness that didn't belong to weather or fatigue, the kind of stillness that made your instincts fold inward, like a warning older than thought. I forced my body to move, heading back toward the direction I'd come from. The beam of my flashlight blinked weakly to life again, stuttering as if struggling to breathe. I kept my eyes ahead, refusing to look back at the light beneath the ice. But the feeling of being followed began to grow with each step. The forest behind me had changed. It was quieter than before, not with the silence of snow, but with the absence of something living. No breath of wind through the trees, no creak of bark. Even my own boots made less sound. The path looked unfamiliar, shadows rearranged, landmarks wrong. I checked my compass again, but the needle spun aimlessly, unable to settle. My GPS screen showed only static. After nearly an hour of walking, I should have reached the truck, but the hollow behind me still felt close, as though I'd never left its radius. Every time I stopped, the glow faintly pulsed again in the far distance, bleeding between the tree trunks, as if the forest itself was carrying it forward. The temperature dropped harder. My breath fogged into heavy clouds that hung motionless before fading. I could feel the vibration again beneath my boots, the same low hum that had broken through my radio earlier. It pulsed faintly through the frozen earth, keeping rhythm with the flicker of that distant glow. Then, without warning, the sound surged louder, deep enough to make the ground tremble. When I turned, I realized the light was no longer distant. It had spread. Small veins of it ran between the trees, tracing the outlines of roots and rocks, converging toward the place I stood. It wasn't like any reflection of moonlight or bioluminescence I'd seen before. It was organized, intelligent, almost like something searching its way through the soil. I dropped to one knee, brushing snow aside again. Underneath, the light ran through narrow cracks in the frozen mud, as though something enormous lay beneath the forest floor. I watched in disbelief as the ground subtly rose and fell, like the breath of something sleeping deep underground. The hum became rhythmic, resonant, vibrating through my ribs. Then the radio crackled again. No voice, just that same pulsing static. But layered within it was something faint, almost like words smothered by distance. My name. It came once, soft but unmistakable, spoken in the same tone my brother used to use. I froze. I hadn't heard his voice since the funeral, yet it was as clear as standing next to me. I shouted his name into the radio, my voice trembling, though I wasn't sure why I did it. There was no answer, only a long drag of silence before the static faded entirely. And that's when I noticed that the prints I had followed were no longer leading away from the hollow. They now led directly toward where I was standing. The forest floor beneath me shifted slightly. The snow rippled outward in a soft wave. I stumbled backward, nearly falling, as faint fractures formed in the crusted ice around the trees. Beneath those cracks, the light gathered, circling slowly, then retreating, as if responding to movement. Something ancient was under there, and it was awake. I don't remember running. I only remember the sound, the way the vibration climbed into my bones, how it matched the rhythm of my heartbeat until I couldn't tell which was which. I must have fallen multiple times on the trek back, because when I finally saw the headlights of my truck through the fog, my hands were torn and numb, my uniform soaked through with half-frozen mud. When I reached the truck, the dashboard lights flickered to life as though they had been waiting. I slammed the door, gunned the engine, and drove. My GPS was blank for several miles until I crossed out of Region 12, where suddenly it rebooted, showing I had somehow been circling the same 3-mile radius for nearly 6 hours. My watch, though, read only 40 minutes since I'd left the station. Back at base, the storm was fully underway. I tried to report the incident in the log, but stopped midway through writing. What could I say? That the ground was breathing, that the ice glowed, that something in the earth had whispered my name. I wrote, equipment malfunction and unstable terrain near South Hollow, and left it at that. Over the following weeks, the Park Service temporarily closed Region 12 due to ground instability. No one asked for my detailed report, but I still couldn't shake what I'd seen. Even from the main station miles away, I sometimes caught glimpses through the trees during night patrol, faint, low lights in the snowline, pulsing gently like underwater lanterns. By early spring, the snow melted enough for geological inspection teams to survey the area. They found collapsed tunnels beneath the hollow, old mine shafts leading to deeper chambers that no one had mapped. The tunnels were unusually smooth, as though carved not by tools, but by erosion of an unknown kind. Some reached depths of over 100 feet before ending abruptly in solid limestone. The part that unsettled me most was what they discovered sealed in one of the deeper pockets a single human skeleton, partially preserved in ice. Based on dental records, it belonged to a park ranger who had gone missing there in 1982, a man whose disappearance was still listed as unsolved. They said the cause of death was exposure, nothing more. But I saw the photographs. His hands were pressed flat against the rock, fingers splayed wide, as though he had been reaching toward the surface. And etched faintly into the stone beside him, nearly erased by frost, was a pattern. A wide circle crossed by dozens of smaller lines that spread outward like veins of light. After that discovery, Region 12 was sealed permanently. No more patrols, no more research, not even for training. The access roads were removed, and nature began reclaiming the boundaries. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see that faint, colorless shimmer bleeding through the snow. It follows the rhythm of a heartbeat I no longer trust to be mine. And though I left Deep Hollow years ago, I still wake at night to the same low hum, vibrating through the silence of my room, soft, patient, and waiting beneath the floor. I started my post at Fire Lake National Preserve, Idaho, in the summer of 2019, when the air was still heavy with pine and the evenings burned orange against the peaks. I had been with the Park Service for 9 years then, moving through a string of western reserves, each one quieter and lonelier than the last. I told myself I liked isolation, that it was part of the job, but truthfully, I had nowhere else to go. My marriage had fallen apart 2 years earlier, and my only son had stopped speaking to me. I thought maybe the silence of the backcountry would help me forget the voices I'd lost. Fire Lake sat deep within the Sawtooth Wilderness, a stretch of country where mountains tore the sky into glass-like ridges, and the wind howled so hard through the valleys that it sounded almost alive. The park wasn't large, but it was brutally remote, 20 miles from the nearest town and reachable only by a single dirt road that turned to mud every spring. The rangers stationed there joked that the place was cursed, though no one ever said it aloud at night. My assignment covered the northern perimeter, including the lake itself, a massive crater lake formed by an ancient volcanic collapse. Locals said the name came from the way its surface glowed red at sunset, though sometimes it seemed to burn even when the sky was gray. The lake was nearly a mile wide and ringed by black volcanic rock that made it look like a wound in the earth. There were no official campgrounds near its edge. Visitors rarely hiked that far in, but every so often, someone would wander off trail, curious about the red water and the strange silence that seemed to cling to its shores. During my first month, I kept noticing how animals avoided the area. Deer tracks would vanish a few hundred yards before the shoreline. Birds veered away mid-flight, and even the insects seemed scarce. Yet there was no pollution, no chemical runoff, nothing on record to explain it. The lake itself was beautiful from a distance, mirror still, flawless, reflecting the mountains so perfectly that it almost hurt to look at. But when you stood close, the reflection didn't quite match what you saw above. Sometimes the peaks in the water were higher, or the trees on the far side appeared to move even when the wind was still. I logged the phenomenon as atmospheric distortion, though I didn't believe it. By late August, the nights had grown colder, and a series of wildfires further south had turned the sky a deep rust color. The air smelled of smoke even when the flames were hundreds of miles away. My shifts rotated between day patrols along the ridgelines and night watch near the lake, where motion sensors had recently been installed to monitor unauthorized campers. I had been the one to approve them, after a few hikers reported seeing campfire glows across the water. We assumed it was poachers or local kids, ignoring the fire restrictions. On my first solo overnight at the lake station, everything felt unusually heavy, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. My cabin sat about half a mile from the shoreline, tucked among the basalt boulders and dead pines. There was no electricity, only a propane lantern, a wood stove, and a radio line connecting to the main ranger post 15 miles away. That night, around 11, the sensor alarm went off. A faint click on the monitor, followed by a red blink. Movement detected along the east bank. The air was still, no wind to trigger the system. I checked my gear, strapped on my pack, and began the slow descent through the rocks toward the waterline. Fire Lake at night was something else entirely. It didn't just reflect the dark. It seemed to absorb it, swallowing every trace of light from the stars. The surface was so smooth that the horizon vanished. As I drew closer, I saw the faintest glow on the opposite side, like a dying ember deep beneath the water. It wasn't bright, but it moved a slow, pulsing shimmer that almost looked alive. I thought it was the reflection of a campfire, just like before. But as I watched, the glow didn't stay in one place. It drifted, sliding along the inner curve of the lake, like something swimming beneath the surface. I turned off my flashlight and crouched low, watching through the fog that clung to the water. The glow grew stronger for a moment, spreading wide beneath the ripples, and then vanished completely. The night turned so quiet I could hear the snow melt, dripping from the cliffs. I waited for nearly an hour, scanning the opposite shore through my binoculars. Nothing moved. The sensor had stopped flashing, and the stillness returned so completely it made me dizzy. I decided to circle the lake, just to be sure no one was out there. The terrain was brutal, black stone and thin gravel that shifted with every step. It took nearly 40 minutes to reach the far side. The glow was gone, but I found something else instead. Near the edge of the water, half buried in silt, lay a small wooden marker. It was barely the size of my hand, carved roughly, the surface darkened by age. There were no words, only a single symbol, a circle split by a vertical line, with short branching cuts radiating outward like veins or cracks. I'd seen that symbol before. It was on a faded ranger report from 1965, documenting an unsolved disappearance. An old park biologist who had been studying geothermal vents around the lake. They never found his body, but his notes described the same pattern, carved into rocks near where his camp had been. The report mentioned that his final log entry claimed the lake moved at night. The words had been dismissed as delirium. Holding that marker in my hand, I understood how easily a person could lose his grip out here. The silence was so absolute it pressed on your mind, shaping thoughts that didn't feel your own. I pocketed the carving, marked the spot on my GPS, and began heading back. That's when I noticed something strange about my footprints. I'd been walking carefully along the same narrow strip of wet gravel that lined the water, yet when I turned to check my trail, I saw double prints, 2 sets of steps, side by side. One set was mine, the other, I can't explain it. They were perfect mirrors of my own, exactly opposite, as though something beneath the surface was tracing me step for step. The reflection on the water wasn't my silhouette anymore. It was still standing when I moved, its head tilted upward as if watching me. And even when I turned away, I could still feel the weight of its stare through the black, endless glass of Fire Lake. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the cabin window, lantern flickering, watching the pale outline of the lake far below. The reflection of the moon drifted lazily across the surface, yet it seemed distorted, stretched, as if the water itself resisted stillness. The double footprints still burned in my mind. I tried to reason with myself. It had to be an optical illusion, an effect of moisture and light. But a deeper part of me, the part that had felt watched since the moment I set foot on that shoreline, whispered that it wasn't. By morning, I was exhausted. The forest felt colder than it should have been for late August. Even the birds were gone, I hiked back down to the shore after sunrise, hoping that daylight would wash away the unease. But when I reached the same stretch of gravel, my stomach twisted. My footprints were still there, perfectly preserved. The second set was gone. Not erased, just gone. The sand where they had been was untouched, smooth flat, as if something had passed over it from beneath. I stood there for a long time, staring out across the lake. In daylight, it looked harmless again, calm, beautiful, almost inviting. Yet as the sun climbed higher, I realized the reflection still wasn't right. The far shoreline and the water appeared closer than it should have been, and the trees on the mirrored side didn't match the ones behind me. They looked younger, fuller, greener. The mountains had a different curve, their ridges unfamiliar. It was as if I was looking into another version of this place, one that existed just a few feet beneath the surface. I stayed until the air turned hot, then returned to the cabin and called in the sensor malfunction report. When I mentioned the glow, the base supervisor laughed it off. Faulty reflection, he said. Maybe sediment reacting to heat. The lake was volcanic. Strange things happened there, but I could tell by the way his tone stiffened near the end that he didn't really believe his own words. He told me to rest, rotate out for a few days, and let the tech crew check the sensors later in the week. I didn't rotate out. Something in me couldn't leave that place. Not yet. For 3 nights, I returned to the shoreline. Each time at the same hour, when the air turned sharp and the mist rolled down from the ridges. Each night the glow appeared again, always faint, always moving beneath the surface like a slow current. And every night it seemed a little closer to the shore. I began to notice small disturbances near the waterline, ripples without wind, faint circles spreading outward from points where nothing had touched the surface. The reflection of the moon would blur, twist, and then settle again, as though something immense passed just below. On the 4th night, I decided to document everything properly. I set up a thermal camera on a tripod, positioned it facing the water, and started the recorder. I stood back at the edge of the woods, trying to steady my breathing. The glow came again, stronger than before, painting the lake in a faint red hue that shimmered like heat rising from asphalt. My camera picked it up clearly, the readings spiking far beyond the water's usual temperature. Then the glow began to move toward me. It didn't swim, it drifted. Slow, steady, deliberate. The surface of the lake rose and fell with it, like something enormous exhaling just beneath. My pulse hammered as I took a step backward, my boots crunching in the gravel. The red light swelled, reflecting across the volcanic stone, and then, just as it reached the shore, everything went still. The lake's surface froze. Not with ice, just absolute stillness. And then I saw it. A face, faint but unmistakable, formed beneath the water. Not human, not entirely. It looked as though the reflection itself had gathered shape, sculpted from light and liquid, the eyes black hollows, staring straight upward. It was positioned directly beneath me, exactly where I stood. For several seconds, I couldn't move. My breath fogged against the cold air, though I didn't remember the temperature dropping. Then the reflection blinked. The shock broke my paralysis. I stumbled backward, tripping over a rock, and when I looked again, the face was gone. Only ripples remained, spreading outward in perfect circles. I snatched the camera and sprinted back to the cabin. The footage played clearly, the glow, the movement, even the stillness. But when the reflection appeared, the screen warped. The pixels bent inward like an eye dilating. The thermal readings spiked to levels that made no sense for water. And then, right before the feed cut, a single frame showed my silhouette standing by the lake, with another darker shape directly beneath my feet. After that night, I tried not to return, but the pull was impossible to resist. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was something heavier, something that gnawed at the back of my mind until I gave in. The air around the cabin began to feel charged, faintly vibrating like distant thunder. Some nights, I could hear faint splashes even when the wind was still. Once, I woke near dawn and saw a smear of wet footprints leading from the door to the edge of the trees. They were mine, yet I hadn't left the cabin. On the 6th night, the sensor alarm triggered again. Same sector, same time. I went because that's what rangers do. We go, even when every instinct tells us not to. The lake was waiting. The mist hung thicker than before, and the glow beneath the water was no longer faint. It was blazing now, swirling in vast circular motions that mirrored the shape carved on the wooden marker I had found days earlier. As I approached, I realized the light wasn't coming from beneath anymore. It was rising. Threads of it drifted upward through the water, twisting like smoke, forming faint outlines that flickered in and out of visibility. For a moment, I saw human figures in that red haze, faces half-formed, eyes closed, mouths open as though calling through the depths. Then the surface broke. Water rose upward in a slow column, not splashing but lifting, as if gravity had lost its hold. Within that column, shapes moved, shadows of people, their features blurred, their motions synchronized. I stumbled backward, but the ground beneath my boots softened. I looked down and saw the black volcanic gravel shifting, liquefying, becoming reflective. In that reflection, I saw myself standing by the water's edge, and beside me stood another version of me, identical in every detail except for the eyes. They were hollow, colorless, reflecting the lake's glow. The reflection smiled. I don't remember falling, but I woke up at dawn lying several feet from the shore, my uniform soaked, my skin burning cold. My radio was dead. The camera was gone. The water was calm again, the lake peaceful and silent. Only one thing remained, the small wooden marker, now resting beside me in the gravel. The carving had changed. The central line through the circle was no longer vertical. It was diagonal, slashing downward like a cut through glass. I reported none of it. I couldn't. The tech team arrived 3 days later and found nothing unusual. No data, no glow, no sign of interference. The sensor had stopped malfunctioning. They told me I'd probably been seeing reflections from wildfire haze. But I knew better. I left Fire Lake at the end of that season, transferred east. But some nights, when I drive along dark roads and catch the faint reflection of taillights on wet asphalt, I see something in the glass. Something standing where my reflection should be. Its head tilted slightly, watching. And when the light hits just right, I can see the same faint red shimmer running beneath its skin, glowing softly, like the depths of Fire Lake waiting below the surface. I arrived at Cedar Pass National Park in Utah in the spring of 2014, when the canyons were still dusted with snow and the wind carried the smell of dry sage. I had just turned 36 and transferred there after a decade, working the wetter northern forests. I wanted sun, space, and a place where the silence felt wide enough to get lost in. Cedar Pass wasn't like the deep green parks of the Pacific Northwest. It was red stone and open desert, mesas that glowed like dying embers under the late light, and gorges that dropped 1,000 feet straight into shadow. It was beautiful in a way that made you feel small, fragile even, the kind of place that could erase you without meaning to. My station sat on the edge of a high plateau overlooking a valley of thin, crooked trees and pale cliffs. The park boundaries extended for nearly 70 miles of uninhabited terrain, most of it unreachable except by foot. There were caves, old petroglyphs, and abandoned mining roads from a century ago. The kind of landscape that held history quietly, as if it preferred to bury its memories in stone. I was assigned to Southwatch Post, a lonely cabin 15 miles from the main ranger base. My duties included monitoring backcountry permits, checking for legal off-road vehicles, and patrolling a restricted section of canyon known as Whisper Gulch. The name came from the way the wind echoed through the cracks in the rock, but locals said it was called that long before the park existed, before there were even roads here. It took me 3 days to grow used to the sound. The wind through the canyon never stopped, and sometimes it carried strange patterns, long, low notes like breath, as though the desert itself were exhaling. I'd grown up around forests where the sound of rustling leaves meant life. Out here, everything was bare. The air moved through emptiness, not over it. During my first few weeks, I grew accustomed to the routines. Every morning I checked the sensor reports, hiked the eastern trails, and made notes on erosion and animal tracks. But sometimes I'd find prints that didn't belong bare feet, long-toed, always in pairs, always ending abruptly near the canyon rim. I assumed tourists or local kids were sneaking in after hours, though the remoteness made that unlikely. By early May, I began spending nights at the overlook cabin on the canyon's edge to shorten my patrol distance. The building was old, built in the 1940s, when the park was first established. It sat alone above Whisper Gulch, with a narrow porch that faced the endless valley. The nights there were like no other. Black skies scattered with thousands of stars, the kind of silence that reached straight into you. It was around that time I started hearing the tapping. It wasn't loud at first, just faint clicks against the outer wall of the cabin, like pebbles tossed by wind. It would happen after midnight, irregular but rhythmic. I'd step outside with my flashlight, expecting to find loose branches or rodents, but there was never anything there. Just wind and the dry smell of sand. Then, one night near the end of May, I found footprints again, bare, long, and deep in the sand just beyond the porch steps. They led toward the canyon, stopping right at the edge of the drop. The soil there was undisturbed, meaning whoever, or whatever, had made them hadn't turned back. They had simply vanished into the void below. The rational part of me tried to explain it. Erosion, weathering, the way sand shifts overnight. But the deeper part of me, the one that had spent years alone in places where nature hides its secrets, knew better. Something had come up from the canyon, not down to it. I stopped sleeping at the overlook after that, though the tapping followed me back to the main cabin. It was never loud, always subtle, just enough to wake me. And every time I checked outside, I'd find a thin film of dust disturbed near the base of the walls, as if small hands had brushed against the wood. In June, the first official incident occurred. 2 hikers went missing on the Southern Rim Trail. Search teams found their tent, their shoes, and their camera, but no tracks leading away. The sand around the site was smooth, like something had dragged across it and erased every step. The last photo on the recovered camera was a wide shot of the canyon at dusk. In the bottom corner, near the shadow of a cliff, was a faint pale figure. At first glance, it looked like glare, but when the image was magnified, the shape had arms, and a face that wasn't quite human. We told ourselves it was lens distortion. We had to. The official report said accidental fall, no remains recovered. But the rescue team leader, an old ranger named Hudson, refused to go near Whisper Gulch again. He transferred out within a month. By July, I had started hearing things in the canyon that weren't the wind. Low, rolling sounds that rose and fell in long tones, almost melodic, like humming. I first thought it was an echo from the highway miles away, but the vibration came from below, deep layered, like many voices blending together. The strange part was that it didn't echo. The canyon usually threw sound back in waves, but this absorbed it. The tones came upward, not outward, carrying through the air until I could feel them in my ribs. Then, one night, while patrolling the ridge at sunset, I saw them. At first, I thought they were deer, pale shapes moving slowly along the lower shelf of the canyon. But they walked upright, thin, too tall, their limbs long and narrow as if carved from bone. They moved without sound, gliding more than walking, their outlines blurred by the haze of dust rising from below. There were 5 of them, maybe 6. I couldn't tell. They stayed near the wall of the canyon, climbing slowly upward toward the rim. I raised my binoculars, and the lens caught one directly. Its head turned, and for an instant, I saw its face, smooth, featureless, except for 2 dark hollows where eyes should have been. I lowered the binoculars, shaking, thinking I was seeing shadows. But when I looked again, the shapes were closer, much closer. I turned and ran for the truck. By the time I reached the ridge road, the sky had turned black, and the canyon behind me was silent again. No movement, no wind, nothing. Only the faint echo of the desert breathing. I told no one. Not because I didn't want to, but because I couldn't. There are some things you can't explain in words that sound sane. I spent the next week trying to rationalize it, convincing myself that it had been the light, the exhaustion, or the heat twisting my vision. But deep down, I knew what I had seen was an illusion. It was waiting, watching, and late one night, when I woke to the soft tapping on my window again, I finally looked. What I saw standing in the dark outside the glass made me realize the canyon wasn't empty anymore. I froze in my cot, staring at the window. The propane lantern cast a dim circle of light, enough for me to see my own reflection in the glass. But there was something behind it, a pale shape, tall, pressed against the outside wall. Its head tilted slightly, as if listening. The hollows where its eyes should have been reflected the faint glow of my lamp, like 2 dark pools. For a long moment, neither of us moved. My breath fogged the glass, but its presence did not. It was as if the air between us belonged to another world entirely. Then the tapping began again, softer now, like fingertips brushing the wood around the frame. Slow, patient, as though it was learning the shape of the cabin. I didn't get up, didn't shout. I just lay there, every muscle rigid, my heartbeat drowning out the sound of the wind. After maybe a minute, the shape pulled back into the dark. The tapping stopped. Only the endless sigh of the canyon remained. At dawn, I forced myself outside. The sand around the cabin was smooth except for faint depressions, long narrow prints leading from the porch steps toward the rim trail. No heel marks, no toes, just smooth, tapering impressions like something had melted into the earth and risen again. I reported none of this. The last time I tried to describe something unusual on a log, it had been quietly removed by the base office before the week was out. Out here, you learned quickly what was acceptable to write down, but the sightings grew more frequent. By late July, I was hearing them every night, soft hums carried up from Whisper Gulch, layered like a chord of voices just below the edge of hearing. They weren't words, but the cadence was deliberate, almost like chanting. The air itself seemed to vibrate with it, and each time the sound came, the walls of the cabin trembled just slightly, as though the desert were breathing under me. Then came the second disappearance. A solo hiker, an older man with decades of backcountry experience, vanished near the southern rim. I was part of the search party. We found his pack neatly set down beside a juniper tree, his canteen full, his radio still working. No signs of a struggle. No prints beyond a single bare footprint leading toward the canyon's edge. Not a fall, no disturbed sand below, no rock slide. Just absence. We called off the search after 2 days. The official report listed probable misadventure, but everyone in the ranger station knew something was wrong. They avoided saying it aloud. I saw the way their eyes drifted toward the canyon when the wind rose at night. One evening in early August, I decided to confront it. I packed a small kit, radio, flashlight, water, and hiked down into Whisper Gulch alone. I told myself it was to map a new erosion point, but really I wanted answers. The deeper I went, the more the temperature dropped. The canyon walls closed in overhead, blocking the sky, until only a thin ribbon of light remained above me. The humming grew stronger, not from ahead, but from below, seeping through the stone like a heartbeat. The air thickened, carrying a faint smell of damp earth and something metallic, like rust. My boots left clear prints in the dust, but as I glanced back, I noticed they were vanishing within seconds, smoothed over by nothing at all. After an hour of hiking, I reached a flat ledge halfway down the gulch. There, carved into the rock, was the same pattern I had seen in the hiker's photograph, a circle with branching lines radiating outward like veins. The carving was fresh, edges sharp, not weathered. Beneath it, the stone was warm to the touch. I crouched there, staring at the symbol, when I felt the vibration shift. The hum deepened, becoming almost physical, a low resonance crawling up my spine. Dust began to trickle from the canyon walls, and then, in the shadows below the ledge, they appeared. Dozens of pale forms, moving slowly upward, their limbs too long, their bodies thin as scaffolding. Their faces were smooth, featureless except for dark hollows, where eyes should have been. They climbed without sound, gliding over stone like mist, their movements synchronized like a tide rising. I backed away, but the ledge behind me ended in a drop. My radio crackled faintly, but no sound came through, only static. The figures stopped a few feet below, their heads tilting upward in unison. For the first time, I saw their mouths, thin slits opening slowly, revealing blackness inside. They began to hum. It wasn't a noise I heard with my ears. It was inside my bones. A low thrumming that matched the beat of my heart until it felt like mine was no longer my own. My vision blurred, edges bending inward. The canyon floor seemed to ripple like water. I stumbled backward, nearly falling over the edge. My flashlight flickered and died. The hum grew louder, pressing into me, filling me, as though they were drawing something out through the sound. Then, just as my knees buckled, a gust of wind howled down the gulch. The sound scattered like dry leaves, and the figures froze. In an instant, they withdrew, melting back into the shadows of the canyon. The vibration cut off. The air went still. I don't remember climbing back to the top. My next memory is standing by my truck at the rim, the sun low on the horizon, my hands shaking so hard I could barely start the engine. My watch said I'd been gone 3 hours. The radio clock said 40 minutes. After that night, I left Cedar Pass. I filed my resignation 2 weeks later, citing personal reasons. The park accepted without question, but I can't forget what I saw. Some nights, even now, I wake to the faint sound of tapping on my window, soft, patient, as though something is learning the shape of my walls. When I walk across a dusty path, I sometimes see my own footprints vanish behind me, as if the earth is swallowing them whole. And every time I close my eyes, I feel the hum again, deep and steady, rising from the dark places beneath the world. The sound of something ancient, waiting to climb back into the light. You've made it to the end, but remember, the story doesn't always end when the video does. If you'd like to support the channel, please like, share, and subscribe. We'll meet again. Until then, take care.